Hey, what's going on? It's at the letters, Arden and Ben Nicholson Smith. Our producers are Christian Ryan and Nicholas Andrade. And a reminder to you that you can always reach out to us at the letters at sportsnet.ca. And today is Thursday, October 21st. Ben, only like 2 weeks since the Blue Jays season ended. I don't know if it feels shorter than that or longer than that. How have the last 2 weeks felt for you?
I would say it feels like it's been more time than two
Yeah.
weeks. I don't know why exactly, but there is this alternate universe where you and Shy and I are kind of crisscrossing the country following a Blue Jays team that somehow made it into the playoffs. And, of course, when you watch the Red Sox or Atlanta or some of these teams that are probably less than superpowers, it's easy to imagine the Blue Jays continuing to play. And with that, there would be so much excitement for this team, and our lives would be a lot more hectic at this point in time. So, not going to lie, it's been nice to kind of be able to reset a little bit and certainly enjoy the playoffs from afar. But yeah, watching closely, and that thought does cross my mind that the Blue Jays would not be out of place in the ALCS if they were there.
No, and this is probably even just a tough postseason for Blue Jays fans to consume because you have to see the Red Sox again and again and think like, man, we were better than that team. And you have to see Alex Anthopoulos in the NLCS and then all these things. It's probably I don't know, maybe it's a bit of a hate watch in a way, but I think that thoughts have turned towards the offseason for the Blue Jays and what they're going to do, how they're going to, in a lot of ways, like rebuild their roster with like some very big free agents heading out the door, a lot of wins heading out the door. We've heard from Ross Atkins, we've heard from Mark Shapiro. They both had press conferences with us, and if you were listening closely, you probably picked up on the fact that they want to get better. That's the talking point. We're gonna get better. We're not, you don't have to get anybody specific. We don't have to get any type of player in particular. We just have to get better. To you, Ben, do you think that better means a team that projects to win more than 91 games? Do you think it better means, a better roster on opening day than they had last year? Is better than the team that played the Baltimore Orioles for 3 games 2 weeks ago? I mean, how would you kind of define better for this team heading into 2022?
Yeah, it's a good question, and certainly can be a moving target over the course of a long season. I would start simple. I would just say they have to win more games. They have to end up winning 92 or 93. Whether they project to do that on opening day, that's tough. Like, you usually don't see a ton of teams that actually project to win over 90.
Yeah.
But they could get there. It's possible. And yeah, ultimately they do have to win more games. Like, it's pretty clear. That's why they're on the outskirts of it all right now. They've got an incredible core, and this is just such a good starting point for any GM to be building from. But they still got a lot of work. Like, there's no question this roster needs to look a lot stronger, especially when you kind of think about this roster not including Robbie Ray and Marcus Semien, which effectively it doesn't. I mean, technically it does, but effectively those guys are gone. This team needs a lot of upgrades.
Yeah, so then you think about being better than 91 wins. And I think in the AL East, like, this year showed you absolutely need to project for more than 99, 91 wins. Well, you have, as you said, subtracted 6.5 wins, nearly 7, from Marcus Semien. Off the top of my head, I don't know what Robbie Ray's WAR ended up at, but I mean, somewhere in the 3, 4, 5 territory. I mean, there's 10 wins right there. Like, you need to replace them, and you can count on some internal replacement if you get better seasons out of certain guys, and if Nate Pearson is able to be healthy and contribute more than he was this year. But it's going to have to come in large part from outside the organization. So you kind of look at the larger framework of your offseason. How much money do you have to work with? Like, that is a huge point here, and that is a huge part of not only Toronto's strategy this offseason, but in off seasons to come, because the Blue Jays are at this very interesting sort of, it's not a pivot point, but like just this very interesting juncture here where Vladimir Guerrero Jr. is hitting arbitration. Teoscar Hernandez getting very expensive through arbitration, nearing free agency. Jose Barrios, same thing, obviously. You'd love to extend him. Bo Bichette's going to hit arbitration next year. He's going to be pretty pricey if he has another year like he just had, and plenty of, premier free agents in this market. So, I mean, when you kind of look at it, Ben, like, how careful or how, just provident do the Blue Jays have to be with how they deploy payroll this winter, considering some of the commitments and things that are kind of on the not really long-term horizon, but like pretty near-term horizon in years to come?
Yeah, exactly. I think you have to be super mindful of that. If you're not mindful of that, then you're operating kind of recklessly. And this front office, I don't think anyone would describe as reckless. So yeah, they're going to be super mindful about what it means for the payroll and for the team and the roster going forward. It's really interesting because if you could only sign players to 1-year deals, the Jays could sign all kinds of players. Like they do have room right now. And Mark Shapiro saying that he anticipates payroll will continue to go up. They still have this core that's largely, in their pre-arbitration years and their arbitration years, guys who are not getting their full market value right now. So that means that they have a fair amount of room to work with in the short term, but very quickly that changes, like you said. And the reality is you need to preserve some flexibility going forward, because you don't want to end up in a situation where you have, in 3-4 years, once Barrios and Teoscar Hernandez are in free agency as well and making the full value of what they're worth, you don't want to find yourself in a position where you have, let's say, $175 million tied up in like 7 players. And maybe that's an extreme, but you also do have Vlad and Bo not that far. Like I know they're far from free agency, but we are to the point too, and we'll get to this, where these guys are legit extension candidates for massive deals. So you look at the best teams like the Astros, the Dodgers, these guys have big contracts, and there is room on the Blue Jays for more big contracts. And I'm by no means saying that they should stop spending. They should keep spending. They should keep adding. They should spend big and move aggressively. But it's not going to be all these guys. Some of them are going to go, and that will be painful at times. But you just start crunching the numbers. I was doing this earlier this week, and there's no room for them all. You can't keep all of these guys.
So let's crunch those numbers then, because like you hit on something really important. That's what Mark Shapiro said, like pretty unequivocally, he expects payroll to rise next year. And like we've talked about this before on the podcast, like if you just kind of reverse engineer what's happened in Blue Jays off seasons and then what Mark Shapiro and Ross Atkins have said prior to those off seasons, lines up pretty clear. Like typically what they say is going to happen is exactly what happens. We've seen it time and again. So like I have no reason to believe the payroll is going down now that Mark Shapiro has said that, or even that it's remaining level. Like from the information that we have right now, it's going up. So you look at $140 million this year was around what the Blue Jays payroll was. So we can start chipping away at that with like the $65 million in guaranteed salaries around for next season. You can chip away at that with the ARB eligible guys who, if you take out Jacob Barnes, who was recently DFA'd, I think it's around, 42 million for those guys. You can throw in like 7 or 8 million for your pre-ARB guys. You're always going to have a handful of those. That gets you to like 115. So 140 minus 115. Do you have like 25 million to work with? That would be if things were level. So if payroll goes up to 150, 155, you can expect that there is north of $30 million in payroll to work with here. Great. You can do a lot with that, like you said. But if you're talking, you look at the holes on this club, 2 starters, a couple open infield spots, you want a left-handed hitter with some on-base skills, plenty of holes in the bullpen, you got to be careful with how you deploy that money. And honestly, it's actually going to be really difficult to address all of those needs in a meaningful impact way through free agency. I think it's almost kind of a safe assumption that there are going to have to be some trades made here. There are likely going to have to be some players even coming off of like the Blue Jays' current 26-man roster in order to make all of these puzzle pieces fit and in order to get that win expectancy over 91 for 2022.
Yeah, I think you're looking at both. I think you have to be looking at both. And so, is that a trade where, you move Randall Grichuk for argument's sake for a back-end starter, and then you sign an extra outfielder in free agency for less than what Grichuk is making, and you cover yourself off that way. I mean, that's like the kind of thing that they could look at. And of course, there are more involved scenarios as well, and you've written about some of these at sportsnet.ca specifically with respect to pitching. But yeah, they have a lot of needs. Like this isn't a team that's one player away. And if they sign, for argument's sake, Marcus Semien, that's great. That's a great start. He's been one of the best players in baseball each of his last 2 full seasons. That's what you want to see on the team. So that would be an incredible start, but still they would have just huge holes on their pitching staff, and they would still need to round out their position player core, even if they added a Marcus Semien. And so, when I look at the big names and the ones that everyone kind of fixates on, and Semien and Ray, like I could see them bringing back one, and of the two, Semien is the easier one for me to see coming back to Toronto. But I definitely, at this point, I don't see them bringing back both.
No, and we talked about it a couple of weeks ago. I think you asked me, you said, hey, do you think there's a world where they can bring back both? And I was like, that's pretty unrealistic. My opinion has not changed on that. I think it's very unrealistic that they both come back. And if you did bring back like a Semien, as you were saying in that scenario, ballpark 20 million AAV, somewhere around there, 22.
I think higher.
Right? Somewhere in that area. Okay, like there goes 2/3 of your $30 million, right? I don't know how you could possibly bring them both back without like either payroll going up to a dramatic degree or without subtracting big payroll from your roster now. Like that's why I kind of think that, I think there's room for the Blue Jays to do one more kind of like marquee, top shelf, high tier guy from this market, like in that range of, Ryu, Springer, like in that AAV of $18 to $24 million, or Springer's 25, I guess $18 to $25 million. Like I think you can get one more of those guys. So is that Semien? Is that Corey Seager? Is that Carlos Correa? I mean, like it could be any of them. But you do that one move, I don't think there's room for another one. I don't think this is an offseason where the Blue Jays are like, hey, we got Seager and Scherzer. Or like, hey, we got, Story and Bryant. Like I just think there's only room for one of those guys on this roster, and everything else is going to have to be a lot more efficient from a payroll perspective.
Yeah, and you think about just the variety of names in free agency. It's a fun time to look at it, and like you even mentioned Scherzer. Yeah, it's tempting to like think about these guys as potential targets for the Blue Jays, but man, it is challenging to reel those guys in. But I do think there's room for one more. I think it could happen as soon as this offseason. I think the Jays should be in on Corey Seager, maybe Kyle Seager too, but probably start with Corey. I think they should be in on Carlos Correa. I think he'd be a great addition. I love the Scherzer idea. Don't think he's coming to Toronto, but I love that idea. And you kind of keep going down the list because there is an opportunity, especially if there's a short-term high AAV guy. Like if JD Martinez is out there at the end of the offseason needing a 1-year deal and you've moved one of your position players, like do you look at that? I don't know, like that could be something. Or Craig Kimbrell, like is he, if the White Sox decline his option or if he's available in trade, like do you look at that? So there are some ways to potentially add short-term payroll. But then again, it comes down to what you were saying too, where how much is this payroll going up? Does going up mean up by 5 million? Does it mean going up by 18 or 23? Or only the Blue Jays know that. And based on what Mark Shapiro was saying, they still are having ongoing conversations with Blue Jays ownership, and that's coming up in the next month or so.
Yeah, maybe the only way to like actually add that second super high impact guy would be on a Semien type of deal where it's like 1 year, $18 million.
Yep.
Okay, like you could probably make the puzzle pieces fit then because you're not like worrying about 23, 24. It's literally just in the vacuum of 22. I don't know if that guy's out there. Maybe he is, and I haven't considered it. The Blue Jays found him last year. That's how they were able to do Springer and Semien, right? That was two of those top shelf guys. It's probably a little tougher this offseason. We'll see. I mean, it's hard for a lot of reasons, right? Like the Blue Jays operated from an incredible point of leverage last winter where they were one of the few clubs that was kind of like splashing around money on free agents. You heard the Blue Jays in on everybody last winter, and a lot of that was real. I think some of that was the Blue Jays getting used, and some of it was, just that the agents were saying like, okay, we're going to the Blue Jays because look, they're aggressive and they're not going to tamp down these rumors. Let me put this out there that we're, and they've called because they've called on everybody. The Blue Jays aren't going to have that leverage this offseason. Like, you got clubs like the Tigers talking about spending money, the Mariners, the Marlins, the Rangers. Like, you got, teams that have not spent in prior years that this winter, like, are saying on the record, yeah, we're going to be active and we're going to be out there and involved. That's on top of, the clubs in New York and Chicago, Houston, LA, like all the typical active teams at this time of year. So the Blue Jays just aren't going to have that same leverage at this time of year to outbid everybody for a Marcus Semien. I don't think there's just going to be a lot of players in the market. So it's going to I don't know if that means how do you think that impacts Blue Jays strategy? Like, there being a more crowded field. I'll ask you because I don't know how to think about it. But what do you think the impact is for the Blue Jays as they approach this offseason, knowing that there's going to be more teams they're competing with?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think strategy-wise, you have to understand what the competition is. There's no question about that. So they have to build that into everything. I mean, if they think that there's going to be tons of competition for, let's say, Carlos Correa, which of course you would expect, then that probably has to take down the odds that you're getting him. And that probably has to, force you to have really robust and well thought out, to use their word, alternatives when it comes to addressing the infield. And of course, that's what they would do regardless, because no free agent is ever a guarantee, even if you think, you're one of two teams in the way that the Blue Jays and Mets were with Springer at the very end of that free agent process. The Mets still could have landed him. And then at that point, the Blue Jays would have had to move on, and they would have had to find some other way to address the needs on this team. So I'm not sure that it would necessarily change much in the way of preparation or strategy, but I think it does change. I think your point is a good one in the sense that it probably changes the odds on how likely is it that the Jays land one of these guys. If there's more competition, then that just means that there's probably a lower chance that the Jays do end up with one of these players.
Yeah, it changes the odds. I wonder if it changes the aggressiveness or the urgency with which they operate. Like, if there is a guy in that mid-tier of your DeSclafanis or your Alex Woods or whatever, or even one of those sort of value plays like a John Gray or a Bundy or a Heaney or whatever, one of these guys that you think there's a lot of upside in and who isn't going to be a mega level on the pitching side, a Gosman or a Ray or a Scherzer. I wonder if you're more aggressive on them because as teams drop out of the bidding for their upper tier guys, they will drop down to the bidding for that sort of mid tier and that value tier. So I wonder if that makes you a bit more aggressive as free agency opens, if you can even be aggressive in a environment where there's a lot of uncertainty around the CBA, to go after those players before their markets get saturated with teams that miss out on kind of the top shelf dudes.
Absolutely. And we saw them do that last year with Robbie Ray. Worked out as well as it possibly could have. Obviously a Cy Young season for Ray. So we could see them repeat that. I think, I guess it's a question of how aggressive do you get? Is it aggressive as far as your pursuit and, maybe the presentation and the timing of things? Sure, I can definitely see that. I don't see the Jays adding an extra year, nor do I think you're suggesting that. But, I don't think that they go and add, 30% more to their offer or add an extra year. But certainly in the way that you time things out, I mean, that could be a factor. But, overall, the people that I'm talking to, and I'm sure you're hearing the same thing, but, the expectation is that this is going to move pretty slowly. And we'll see the qualifying offer decisions. Jays have one really interesting one there, and Steven Matz. We'll see, of course, there's some roster deadlines that still take place every year, such as paring things down for the Rule 5, such as making sure that you get your tender decisions in early December. But I think free agency is going to play really slowly. And, I think this might benefit teams in the sense that once you get closer to spring training, players sometimes get a little uneasy. They want to sign a deal. And I'm sure that's part of MLB's overall approach to this as well, because in the process of negotiating the CBA, they might also have this nice little side effect from their standpoint where they get some bargains on players.
Yeah, I don't think that aggressiveness or urgency would change your value on a player, but it could change like how quickly you get close to that value in negotiations. You know what I
Sure.
mean? Because you enter in and you don't come in with like, this is the absolute max that we'd pay this guy. You come in lower than that, and you don't really make your best offers until, the rubber meets the road. Maybe earlier you kind of get to that value that you have on a guy, and maybe earlier you're a bit more aggressive in how close to that value you sort of bid on him to try to get something done. Because you're right, like this offseason is going to be slow unless there's a new CBA on December 1st, and then it's like full steam ahead. We'll see. I don't know whether to feel confident or not about that. We're not hearing a lot of like back and forth in the media between the two sides, so you can like read that as a good thing, but you could also read that as they just aren't talking a lot right now. I don't know. But without a new CBA in December, you think about any team that is bumping up against the competitive balance tax as it stands today, whether you are, the Yankees or the Phillies or whoever, you're going to want to know what that new CBA looks like so that
Yes.
the frameworks going ahead. And as a free agent, as soon as one of those bidders says, yeah, we're going to wait and see what this looks like, well, you're saying, well, I'm going to wait because that's a potential bidder. That's somebody who could possibly drive up my market. The more people bidding for me, the better. So maybe there is a new CBA scenario where the Yankees get more money to play with, or, with, teams like, well, the Astros are going to have a lot of money anyway, but you know what I'm saying? So I think that could create some stall in the market. As it pertains to the Blue Jays, they aren't worried about that at all because they aren't spending to the CBT. I see no situation this offseason or candidly in any like year going ahead where the Blue Jays touch the CBT. So they can be aggressive, and they can like operate with that urgency and up their bids early in free agency and see if there's something out there. That's not a play that's going to work well with kind of the upper tier guys. But I wonder if it is a play that could work well with like kind of that middle tier group. And maybe you come away early again with this year's version of Robbie Ray.
Yeah, I could see that. I want to go back to the point you made too about how the pacing is going to be impacted by the uncertainty around the CBT, because I think it's a really good point. I think that as soon as you have, and teams don't know what the CBT is for next year, and teams care about the CBT. Not, as you said, not the Blue Jays based on what Mark Shapiro said when I asked him about that a few days ago. But the Red Sox, the Yankees, even the Dodgers, they go over it, but they still probably want to know for their accounting purposes, okay, if we go over by X amount, what does this mean for our spending? I mean, that's a question that I think an ownership group would want to know. I don't talk to a lot of owners, but I get the sense that that's probably a key piece of information for any business. So that's not going to be available until there is a new CBA. And so, yeah, I think that slows things down. I think that it takes bidders out, it slows things down. And that's, I just, the more I think about it, the more I listen to people whose opinions I respect on this, like, I just think we're in for a really slow winter. So don't expect, I'm telling this to myself as much as anyone else, but like, don't expect a lot of activity in November. This is probably going to go into February, as we've seen, even without a negotiation. But I think this year, certainly that'll be the case.
And it's, the balance that all teams are going to be working with is that's what makes it so interesting for the Blue Jays, because, they're not talking about CBT, but they are thinking about the balance of payrolls going forward and about, a lot of the decisions that are upcoming, as we said, with, potential extensions, with guys getting pricey in arbitration. Like, if I know one thing about the Blue Jays front office is that they put a lot of value in flexibility. Like, they like to be able to adapt and react on the fly. They don't like to be like locked in to a spot where like you are, the Phillies of yesteryear, where you're just like out of money. Your roster is like so bloated with, big contracts and your hands are tied and you can't do anything. They like to be able to pivot and to move. Like, you wrote about it a little bit at sportsnet.ca as it pertains to the Dodgers. Like, the Blue Jays want to be in a position where they can move on from star players, where they can like have like really good players coming out the door and still be able to field competitive teams, like to not be in these situations where you are staring at like the payroll chart and it's going over to 23, 24, 25, 26, and you're seeing these massive numbers. I think they can have a few massive numbers. They already have one in George Springer. I think they could add another this winter, but I think the biggest priority for them is just being nimble and just being able to maneuver going forward, and building that balanced roster. And that's where it's going to make the decisions throughout this offseason like super, super fascinating and impactful for the Blue Jays.
Yeah, 100%. And I'm glad you brought that up because I do want to get into that a little bit. Like, I think that, and this is an area where the Blue Jays have messed up before. Like, you think about the Kendrys Morales deal, man, what a whiff in hindsight. Yeah. And I wish that at the time I had been more critical of it because, you know, really, you're signing a 34-year-old going into his age 34 season, a DH, positionless, slow, on the decline. Like, you didn't have to necessarily be like, Theo Epstein to see that deal came with some significant risk and probably limited upside. They made it anyway, and it didn't work. And so that's the kind of deal that you can't be making. And even with players who are in their prime, you look at the teams that get overly attached to guys, and it's like, there's a phrase for it. I think it's the winner's curse, which basically you win a certain way. You think, okay, this is the only way we can win. This is how we have to win. And then you hold on to these guys who got you there instead of holding on to the ways of thinking that got you there, holding on to the systems that got you there and the habits, the skills that got you there. And we've seen the Dodgers very skillfully avoid getting overly bogged down with contracts. And it's not just the money. It's also the fact that if you're signing these guys to big contracts, they're going to have expectations as far as playing time. They're taking up one of your 40 roster spots, which is very valuable. And it basically locks you in on a number of fronts. So the Dodgers in recent years have let Yu Darvish go. They've let Yasmani Grandal go and Manny Machado go and Zach Greinke go. And these are Hyun-Jin Ryu to the Toronto Blue Jays. They trade Kenta Maeda. Jock Peterson and Kike Hernandez are having these incredible seasons with new teams. So the Dodgers are letting these guys go. All-stars, maybe even Hall of Famers in some cases, often in their primes, but they're also retaining some key players and they're preserving flexibility so that they can go out and sign Justin Turner to a 2-year deal or sign Blake Trinan for 1 year or make a trade at the deadline and acquire Trey Turner and Max Scherzer. And maybe this year, Scherzer and Seager and Chris Taylor all depart in free agency, but they're still going to be good. And of course, the Dodgers, like, they're the ideal, and no team is going to replicate that perfectly. But I do think there's a lesson to be learned there as far as not getting overly attached, which isn't to say, again, it's not to say you should go out and be the Rays, because the Rays operate at a disadvantage every year. You might as well spend it, if you can, selectively, but you can't keep everyone.
The Dodgers can spend. They blow right past that CVT that we were talking about, other teams kind of dancing around and trying to stay below, and they pay penalties for that, and they still find a way to find steals in the draft and to develop guys at a really high clip and to keep having like really good players coming up through their system, who are also players that they use in trades, right? They're able to acquire a Mookie Betts and then extend him to an insane contract that like they are okay with taking because they have that budget. Like, I think that for all teams, or for the Blue Jays especially, like, the goal is to have this like very balanced roster where you have like a couple of guys on those big time deals, right? And like Hyun-Jin Ryu's on a big deal because the Dodgers let him walk. George Springer's on a big deal with the Blue Jays because the Astros let him walk. Both those teams still playing today, by the way, here in late October, which tells you something. You have a few of those guys. And then you have some players who are maybe a year or two into arbitration. Maybe they're on, extensions that give you cost certainty. They're in that sort of like 26 to 28-year-old sort of range. You know what they're going to cost. You have that layer of your roster. And then you have your youth and your young pre-ARB players who are providing all kinds of surplus value, as Vladimir Guerrero Jr. and Bo Bichette did last season. Like, you don't want to be too heavily slanted towards any one of those three categories. Like, you kind of want a balance of them. And that, like, just keep maintaining that balance and having, like, managing your roster that way. It sort of requires turnover. It requires players to be going out the door and new players to be coming in. Like, it requires your front office to be really active. So that's why your point is really well taken. Like, this idea that there's ever going to be a team that just runs back the same roster year after year after year, I don't know how realistic it is in 2021, 2022 MLB. Like, you are going to have to be very actively managing your roster and constantly shuffling the deck if you want to win sustainably rather than having these like huge peaks and valleys.
And of course, with that being said, like, I'm not trying to, take away from the 2021 team and how fun it was. And if they could just hit refresh for 1 year and pay everyone the same amount, like, that would be an incredible way to go. Of course, there would be some tweaks and you'd still look at some trades, but that would be an awesome team. Like, the Jays were really good. They finished so strong. They had a very, very talented roster. So this is a good team. It's always great to see players get paid, but if you're intent on sustaining that, then you have to be selective about which guys you keep for the long term.
Yeah, no, there's a very clear way to bring back Robbie Ray and Marcus Semien. Just sign them both to 1-year deals.
Yeah.
Worked this year.
I'm not sure those guys will be so interested in that, right? But you can always try.
Let's hear your pitch. We'll step away, but when we come back, that was kind of the macro discussion with the Blue Jays. Again, just some more micro offseason decisions and factors and things that are coming up for the Blue Jays when we continue on At The Letters. It continues on At The Letters. Arden Zwelling, Ben Nicholson Smith. Our producers are Christian Ryan, Nick Andrade. Will be here with you throughout the Blue Jays offseason, but we haven't even gotten there yet. Playoffs still ongoing. Ben and I still have an over-unders episode to get to, likely come on your way sometime soon in the next couple weeks. And then the offseason will get rolling. And I mean, sort of the first decisions, or like really high leverage decisions for the Blue Jays to make, are going to be qualifying offers. And there's 3 players who are clearly candidates. 2 of them are rather obvious. You're going to qualify Robbie Ray. You're going to qualify Marcus Semien. Yep. But the third, in Steven Matz, is open to some interpretation, and everyone's mileage may vary on this. I remember, Ben, we talked about this on the podcast in like August. Like, I wrote about it at sportsnet.ca, just kind of as Steven Matz was having that role and as he was like pitching really strong that month, thinking, is he pitching his way into a qualifying offer? At the very least, he's making it a conversation, and it would not have been a conversation in April and May, in June. But come the end of the season, I think it is a conversation. I think it is a debate worth having. I promise you it's a debate the Blue Jays are having in their front office. Where do you kind of lie on it? What do you think you would do? Would you qualify Steven Matz or would you not?
Well, I do think it's become a more interesting discussion, and that's obviously a credit to Steven Matz. I think even, at the time that you mentioned that, I was like, I don't know if I see it. And I'm sure our listeners remember, at the time, and maybe they had a similar reaction. I don't know. But, since that point, he finished strong. Like, he built himself a really good season, and basically 150 innings, well above average ERA, pretty good FIP and xFIP, and strikeout rate. Some of these behind the scenes metrics that suggest that this wasn't purely the product of some good luck or some good defense behind him. He actually pitched well, and so give him full credit. Great season. I don't know though. Like, to me, I still land on not qualifying him.
I'm with you on that. Like, I think there's a case to be made. And I think there's definitely debate within the Blue Jays about what to do there, because it doesn't just impact Steven Matz. Like, it impacts everything else you're going to do in the offseason, because you have to operate from a point where you expect him to accept it. Even with Ray and Semien, like, you are operating from a point where they will never accept it, but you expect that they will, and you have a plan for what would happen if they do, because that's like $18.4 million that you were putting on the table. You don't put that on the table like, oh, he'll never accept it. I don't know. What if the guy does, right? And
That's why Oakland didn't do it last year with Semyon.
Exactly, because they couldn't. They didn't have that money.
So they didn't do it. Yeah,
they couldn't afford it. So if Steven Matz accepts an $18.4 million 1 year salary, then that changes everything else you do in the offseason. Like that just impacts everything. It's everything we were talking about in the first half. If you have $35-40 million to spend, whatever it is, there's 18 of it, poof, gone into Steven Matz. So you have to be very, like you have to game out that scenario under which he accepts it. So you can absolutely, and like, even just to pull back the curtain a little bit, like the Blue Jays started this offseason with like by distributing a questionnaire to everybody in their front office. And I promise you that was one of the questions on there. Right. Was like, should we qualify Steven Matz, or how should we approach Steven Matz? Like, how should we game this out? Just like, should we be more aggressive in pursuing bullpen options would have been part of it. Like, I think this is something where there is quite a bit of debate there, because you really can make a case either way.
Yeah, and the case for it would be he pitched great. Pitching is hard to acquire. The Blue Jays need pitching, and he's shown a compatibility both with the Blue Jays' internal people and also with pitching in the American League East, which is no easy feat. He's not particularly old. Certainly would expect him to be a good Major League starting pitcher next year. There's limited risk in a 1-year deal. And hey, if he declines and he goes out there and signs with somebody else, you get a draft pick. So there's actually some upside built in. So I get it. I mean, there is a case there. But again, sure, in theory with Semyon and Ray, like you have to game out the scenario where they accept. But like that's 1%. Like it's maybe less than 1%. You're not expecting that at all. And if it happened, that would be an amazing, pleasant surprise. Like that would be great news if somehow they accepted. With Matz, I don't know. And I don't know. I haven't talked to Steven Matz about this, so I don't know where he would be leaning. But I have to imagine that there is a substantial chance that he would just take it if they make that offer. And like you said, that would start to impact other things. The opportunity cost there is significant with respect to $18 million, because toward the end of this offseason, I guarantee you, if you're sitting there with $18 million to spend on pitching, you'll find 2 good pitchers, maybe 3, but you'll find 2 good pitchers. And the Jays need a lot of good pitchers.
He's right in that murky area where like you can make the case. It's like that, like where Gausman was, where kind of Stroman was,
Odorizzi,
where Odorizzi was, right? Where you can absolutely make the case based on innings, based on ERA, based on peripherals, but also where the guy could have some motivation to take it. And we've seen like those guys that we just mentioned take the offer. So I just think that in the greater context of the Blue Jays offseason, the money they have to spend and the holes they have to fill, I don't think they can afford the risk of. It's funny to even paint it as a risk. Like I'm sure they would feel it's a good thing, but like I don't think they can afford like tying up $18 million in Steven Matz next
Agreed.
Season. I just don't think they can, and I think he might accept it. So that's why I would not be extending him a qualifying offer.
Yeah, and so that means you don't get a pick for his departure. He just leaves. But you know what? That's okay. You probably already got a lot out. You definitely already got a lot out of Steven Matz. That was a great trade. You don't need to go and try to keep getting more from that trade and keep doubling down. It's almost like we were talking about before, where sometimes you say, that was great. That worked out awesome for Steven Matz, for the Blue Jays, for everybody. And now, they can see what happens. It doesn't mean they can't bring him back for less than that amount too, by the way. He could come back for 1 year and 11. I mean, there's no reason that's an impossibility. But the QO to me would be a little high.
2 years, 25. Like I think that you're talking to Steven Matz for sure, because I think the Blue Jays believe there's still upside there, right? And clearly they know him very well after this year, and he's had a year of working with P. Walker and Bushman, and like he knows the team, and like all those things, like all those elements, all that familiarity. So I think you're absolutely engaging him this winter, after you don't extend him the qualifying offer, while at the same time looking to guys like John Gray or Andrew Heaney and looking for like your next sort of value play, which I know Matz was in a trade, but you didn't trade anything for him. Like your value play, like a Robbie Ray. Like I think you're also kind of while you're looking for those guys, you were also talking to Steven Matz and seeing if you can kind of line up on value there. Because as we've said, like the Blue Jays have to be very careful with payroll this offseason. That extends to trades as well. You are also going out and looking at other clubs and looking for the next Steven Matz you can trade for the guy who's devalued, coming off a tough year. You know, maybe that club's in a tough payroll spot and the guy's arbitration eligible and they might want to move off of him. You know, maybe it's just like a change of scenery thing, whatever. Like you are looking for that next opportunity to bring in 2022's Steven Matz while talking to the actual Steven Matz at the value he's at right now.
Absolutely. And I like the 2-year deal idea for Matz or for somebody else. I mean, again, it goes back to the discussion we had before, but like 1-year deal, 2-year deal, that is a good time for the Blue Jays to be making those deals because they still have, you know, Vladdy's ARB eligible this year and he'll be up over $10 million next year, but that's a fraction of what he would be making as a free agent. Same with Bo Bichette. Bo Bichette is pre-ARB this coming season, so they've got some room to work with. If you want to do a 2-year deal for Matz, for some other, you know, mid to back end starter, nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, Bo Bichette and like Breivik Valera paid the same amount or you know, Otto Lopez,
Taylor Saucedo, and Bo Bichette.
Yep. Right. Making about the same amount.
I really
think for now, yes. For now. Future earnings very different. I really think that there has to be like multiple trades really this winter, or you know, maybe only one, but like the Blue Jays just have to trade this winter, I think, for a number of reasons. Everything that we've talked about prior. Also the fact that the Blue Jays like have just a better idea of who their players are. Now, like going into 2021, you still were kind of doing we want to give this guy a bit more run, right? Like, we want to see about that dude. Now you just have a lot more certainty. Like, think about it. Going into 2021, is Teoscar Hernandez still this? Coming off a 60-game season, like, is this what he's going to be? Is Bo Bichette going to be an everyday shortstop in the bigs? Are we committed to him at that position? Is Rowdy Tellez going to carry over the adjustments that he made in 2020? A lot of those questions were answered. Rowdy Tellez now in Milwaukee. Bo Bichette, I mean, the Blue Jays have been like pretty straightforward in committing to him as a shortstop for 2022 and beyond. It's kind of hard to see him not playing that position on opening day next year. You know, you're thinking about a Corey Seager at like third base or bring back a Marcus Semien at second base around Bichette. Teoscar Hernandez
at third.
Correa at third, right? Teoscar Hernandez, you now like know this is what he is. Like this is the guy that is established. Like the track record is there and proven. So you just have a lot more certainty now, which like impacts you in trades, not only in what you bring in and like the holes that you know you need to fill and what you're working around, like you know where those are, but also if you're trading off of your 26, which I'd kind of expect the Blue Jays to do this offseason, you now have much more concrete ideas of what these players are and what they could mean to other teams as you look to make your club better.
Yeah, no, that's right. I think I could see them trading position players. Like it's a little harder for me to imagine them trading significant pitchers because it's such an area of need for them. It almost defeats the purpose. Although, you know, teams asked about Nate Pearson this year, probably ask about him this winter, and the Jays probably hold on, would be my guess. So then it kind of does lead us to position players, and I think there is some depth with respect to catching. I'm sure the Blue Jays will listen on guys like Alejandro Kirk and Danny Jansen. Gabriel Moreno coming up. He debuted in the Arizona Fall League just the other day, so that's a great sign for the Blue Jays. Also, he's going to be getting some infield reps there, which you never know, like how things play out. And does his bat carry him to the majors in a bit more of a hybrid role? I mean, that's all to be determined. But there is some catching depth, so you could look at that. And I think also in the outfield, I mean, that's the other logical place, whether it is Grichuk, who, you know, based on the way the Blue Jays were using him, you would draw the conclusion that they don't view him as an integral part of this team moving forward. And Lourdes Gurriel Jr., too, to me is interesting. So all those names, I don't know which ones of those jump out to you, Arden, but all those names to me are possibilities as the Jays think about different trades.
Grichuk, Gurriel, Kirk are the ones that that jump out to me, and for all the reasons you said, right? Like, Blue Jays clearly have, well, I don't know if you ever have a surplus of MLB catchers. I don't know that any team does, but the Blue Jays have some very interesting young controllable catchers. The Miami Marlins are looking for catching this offseason. So, and they are sitting on quite a stockpile of young pitching talent. And again, not a category, not a position you ever feel great about, like not a position that you ever could even have a surplus in, right? You can't have too much pitching. I don't know that you can have too many catchers, but you would think that there is some sort of, like, there are discussions to be had there between Miami and Toronto. Toronto sending a catcher to Miami, Miami sending a pitcher to Toronto. With Gurriel, like, the thing about him is the contract and the fact that he's making like between $2 and $4 million each season in the next few, like, that opens up the array of teams that you can talk to about Gurriel, where like you can talk to the Oakland Athletics about him, like, and they're going to need corner outfielders. You can talk to, if the Cincinnati Reds are going to be up against, where their payroll is going to be, you can talk to the Cincinnati Reds about him, right? Like you can talk to a lot of teams about him, even ones that don't run super high payrolls, even ones that don't have a ton of room on their budget sheet, just because of what he costs. So, you can go out and get a pitcher for Lourdes Gurriel Jr. Grichuk, you mentioned, you have to get more creative with him just because of the contract situation, because he obviously didn't have a strong 2021, and because, as you mentioned, the Blue Jays sort of tipped their hand towards how they feel about Randall Grichuk in the usage down the stretch. But I still think there are like creative avenues you can find. Like the Philadelphia Phillies are not committing to Didi Gregorius as their starting shortstop next year. Like they have been very wishy-washy on him. Another guy who's coming off of a 2021 that was by no means a quality one, but it stands out as, quite a diversion from where he had been earlier in his career. And there are some injury issues there as well. You could swap a Gregorius and a Grichuk, two players coming off of down years who have money committed to them. Gregorius comes in, plays some third, some second for the Blue Jays. Grichuk goes and plays the outfield for the Phillies. Phillies need an outfielder. And you kind of both make a bet on the guy. I could see something similar with the Houston Astros. Jake Odorizzi is very much on the outside of that pitching, of that starting rotation picture. And looking in, just look at the postseason innings and how they have been deployed here. And McCullers isn't even healthy right now. The Astros might be looking to move Jake Odorizzi this offseason, particularly with some of the young pitching that they have on the way up, particularly if they go out and sign somebody to replace a Greinke and a Verlander. That's another guy, Odorizzi, coming off of a down year, but it stands in stark contrast to where he was, earlier in his career and what the track record suggests. Maybe there's a Grichuk Odorizzi swap. Like it's kind of like a challenge trade. It's a baseball trade in a lot of ways, where you are both like exchanging players who, are coming off of down years and have money committed to them, but fill a roster hole for you, and are reasonable bounce back bets to perhaps improve in 2022.
Yeah, I think that's the kind of trade that would be realistic for Grichuk. Let's dive in on Gurriel Jr. because I think it's super interesting. And you mentioned an interesting one with Oakland and like these smaller market teams, because you're right. He makes $5 million this year, $6 million the year after that. And then in his third year of control, he would again be arbitration eligible. He would go through the arbitration process. So you're talking about a very reasonable amount of money. Now, I could see, you mentioned Oakland and Sean Manaea, one of the pitchers that you mentioned in your piece on possible targets for the Blue Jays. This is a guy that the Jays back in 2015 almost acquired from Matt Boyd, by the way, and he's gone on to have a really good career, Manaea. So you could look at that. I mean, that's the sort of move where, and you could do that and Grichuk, and then you have to backfill in the outfield. But I mean, if you're the Blue Jays, you can, and this is just brainstorming here and just hypothesizing to be very clear here. But, if you're the Blue Jays, there actually are a fair number of corner outfielders out there. And Toronto is a pretty appealing place to play for a hitter, especially in this lineup, in a ballpark that's pretty hitter friendly. Now the Jays have a lot more certainty about where they're playing. That could help in the recruitment of free agents this year. So, do you look at some of the guys that we're seeing starring in October right now, whether it's a Kyle Schwarber or a Jock Peterson, Eddie Rosario, or some of the guys from Oakland, whether it's a Starling Marte or a Mark Canha. I mean, those are guys that you could kind of backfill if you're the Blue Jays because you have this payroll flexibility. So you can pay those guys what they're worth, whatever it is. Let's call it, for argument's sake, you sign one of those guys for $10 million, $11 million over 1 year. Of course, Marte would be much beyond that. But let's say you sign one of those guys for something in that range. Then you can move Gurriel Jr. to a team that can't sign those players for what they're worth. They're not going to sign them for 25 over 2 or for 10 over 1, whatever the case. They need to acquire someone in trade, and that's where Gurriel comes into the picture. And I know, some people might view him as a core piece, but I just, you look at the production, like his OPS plus is 1 point off of Kyle Schwarber's for his career. I think it's like 118 and 119. They get there in different ways. Gurriel Jr. brings you way more average. Schwarber probably brings you more power. But the end result is a corner outfielder who really hits and who doesn't field well. And so they're not so different. And I think that's the sort of thing where if you really wanted to get creative, and again, Schwarber, maybe he's looking at a 2-year deal because he had a great season. But if Schwarber's some, left-handed bat brings you some OBP and some patience, like it wouldn't be the worst thing, especially if it would open up a trade avenue in the process of moving other pieces around.
You're looking for this year's Marcus Semien. How about Michael Conforto coming off of a down year with the Mets? Maybe he wants to take that 1 year, prove it, bet on yourself, contract, reestablish his value, jump back into the market. There's a left-handed bat, a guy with a history of getting on base. Obviously didn't have a great 2021, but career OBP is up over 350 still, and a guy with some pop as well. Can play a corner outfield spot for you if you are moving on from a Gurriel and Grichuk. Like there's another guy who maybe you could have on a 1 year deal. I think you're right. The Oakland Athletics are a team that, like, it's hard for me to see how they're not gonna make a move from their pitching this year. Like you just look at where their payrolls have been, and I don't anticipate the Athletics are suddenly going to start spending $120 million a year on payroll. So like it's going to be very tough for them to make the puzzle pieces fit because their arbitration class is like insanely loaded. It's a freaking all-star team. Like Olsen and Chapman are in there, and like you said, Manaea, Chris Bassett, this guy doesn't really get talked about, a bit of a veteran, and like doesn't have, his stuff doesn't blow you away, but he gets the job done. Man, like the ERAs are great. He's very good at limiting hard contact. That's a guy who's going to be, making $8-9 million in arbitration. Maybe that's a target. Maybe, Oakland wants to trade a Frankie Montas, like that's going to be hard because he's got more control and he's coming off of a huge year, and he's cheaper, but like those are the type of players that you could target from Oakland. I think the Cincinnati Reds are another club that the Blue Jays need to be calling pretty frequently. Like we'll see what they do with their payroll. Like it's very unclear right now, but what we saw last offseason was them knocking down payroll. Archie Bradley was non-tendered. Raisel Iglesias was sold like just for purely a salary dump, essentially. Maybe the Reds again are bringing payroll down. Even if they aren't, even if they are keeping payroll just consistent, like they have, a pretty tricky like puzzle to put together, just like the Athletics did. Like they have a large arbitration class. They have a lot of money tied up in guys like Moustakas, Votto, obviously, Suarez, and they have players going through arbitration who are getting more costly, like Luis Castillo, like Tyler Mahle. These are guys the Blue Jays could target and who the Blue Jays could be in on if Cincinnati wants to move those guys. Obviously, Castillo was the focus of trade discussions last offseason. Sonny Gray was as well. The Blue Jays want to take his very affordable contract off of their hands, a guy who gives you mid-rotation results as a veteran, would fit in for the Blue Jays. Even a Wade Miley, if the Blue Jays believe Wade Miley has another year like he just had in him, you can do a lot worse than I think he makes $10 million next year. You could do a lot worse than that as your 4 or 5 with a sort of higher upside addition atop your rotation. I think there's a lot of ways those two clubs could line up as well. It's just going to depend on what the Reds are kind of motivated to do this winter. And as we sit here right now, I don't know if it's clear what their strategy is going to be.
Right. And obviously talking about players who would have very different trade values, right? Like obviously a Castillo, you're talking probably about top prospects. If it is a Wade Miley, like might be pretty modest return. And that also kind of connects for me back to Steven Matz. And, as you start to look down the list of these options, it doesn't make me think that extending a qualifying offer is a better idea. I don't find myself pulled more in that direction as you start looking down these options. And of course, that's what the Blue Jays have to do. And they do this as all teams do. They have to look at the totality of these options that they think are going to be available. And so, maybe if it is a particularly strong class for veteran starting pitching, okay, how does that impact the Blue Jays? Do they have a chance at signing, let's say, a Greinke, though he's not looking great these days? Do they have a chance at a Verlander? Do they have a chance at a Scherzer? If no, then you got to move on and figure out, okay, how else are they going to get pitching? What about the corner outfield bats for a team that on paper has all of the outfielders that they could want, but maybe there's a way to get creative there and to take advantage of the fact that there's actually some decent depth to the corner outfield short-term market, and see where that leads and how it can potentially connect to the Blue Jays.
Yeah. The Blue Jays have like a bunch of different avenues that they can take this offseason, but I would argue that is exactly where they want to be and where they always want to be, where like all of their options are open. Like you look at where they're positioned right now, like you said, they could play at the top end of the free agent market for a Seager, for a Correa, whoever. They can play in those middle tiers. They could play in, pitching like bounce back value plays. They can play in trade either by moving guys off of their current 26-man roster, as you mentioned, some of the names that we have brought about. They have prospects that they can trade from, like of different classes. They have sort of Rule 5 eligible dudes and like edge of the 40-man dudes, like who, like your like Zach Loebs or Kevin Smiths, like interesting guys there. They have further down, like deeper, farther off 19, 20-year-olds, lower level of the minors, higher upside prospects to deal from as well. They have a lot of flexibility and a lot of different avenues that they can take. And I think that's kind of the position that they want to be in forever. Like they want to be in this position every winter where they're not locked into, we have to do this or we have to do that, or the only way to improve is this. We actually have a lot of variability in the way that we can chart this out. So we can be aggressive and go get the off season, or we could even sit back and kind of let the off season come to us, see how chips fall, and find our optimal path to building the best team possible for the following season.
Right, which is why I think like if they are going to make early strike, it has to be for a player they really believe in. I don't think that it makes sense to make an early strike just because you're kind of scared that the market might move in a certain way, or you're apprehensive about where trade talks might lead. I think they are in a good spot. They've got an incredible core to build around. They have one of the best players in baseball. They have a second franchise piece that would easily be, on the side of the stadium in probably 20 markets out of 30 in Bo Bichette. And they've got more beyond that. So with that being said, they have tons of work to do. The team as it stands now is not good enough, and they clearly need to be adding in meaningful ways and spending in meaningful ways. And how all that unfolds, it'll be super interesting to see.
Oh yeah, in Baltimore they would have a Teoscar Hernandez banner on the side of the stadium.
Oh yeah,
in Arizona, right? It would be every weekend.
It would be Josh
Palacios bobblehead.
Yeah,
right.
100%.
Have players like who maybe are not thought of as like the faces of the franchise in Toronto, who would be in other markets.
Jordan Romano. I mean, 3 years ago, Jordan Romano would have been everywhere. This Canadian closer who's having this great season. Now he's like number 10 on the list of core players. And that's not a knock on Jordan Romano. It's just that they have a stacked team. It was, especially last year's version of the team, had a ton of star power. That's not easy to replicate. And, we'll see if they do replicate that moving forward, because Semyon and Ray, that's a lot of talent that's potentially out the door. But absolutely. In other markets, the number like Santiago Espinal would have a t-shirt day. Like it's just, it really is, it's a team with a lot of stars.
Yeah, no kidding. Very, very interesting offseason ahead, and Ben and I are going to be here to talk you through it as the Blue Jays start making moves, start putting together a 22 roster that they want to be better than their 21 roster. Going to be very interesting to see how they do that. We're going to step away. He's Ben. I'm Arden. Our producers are Christian Ryan and Nicholas Andrade. You can always reach out to us at the letters at sportsnet.ca. Stay tuned for the over-unders recap, which is coming your way. Stay tuned for ATL throughout the offseason. Till then, talk to you next time on At the Letters.